Now, you old country people, you remember your old mama's stove. Some of them are even being used today. But I'm an old man now, but I can remember many a time staying at my mama's house. We called her Mammy. And you'd be sleeping there early one morning, and she'd be in there, you could hear her in there messing with that stove, and she'd holler, "Boy, get your butt up out of that bed and go out and get me some kindling and some bucket of coal. We want something to eat. You better get out here." I'd get up. It'd be a cold morning looking out across that holler. And I'd get a load of coal up, an old bucket of coal, and some kindling there out from under the shed. Take it in there, and she'd already have that stove already glowing red. And I'd feed that stuff in there, put a big lump of coal in there, and you'd think you was going to melt it down. But I could remember that like it was yesterday. Now these old stoves, they're still being used, especially for people off the grid, but they're a thing of the past. But I'm going to share with you some of the old stoves, how our people used to cook, how they got started, and what they're still doing today. Now I look at these new box stores at some new appliances, see what they got. You can see all these fancy gas ranges, propane, electric, convection electric, tops of gas of any kind of modern stove you want. Fancy gas stoves. They've got some nice ones. They've even got old stoves here that look like the old kind of stoves, but they're electric. They just look like the old style cook stoves. But this is electric oven, convection top. But look at the price of it. My goodness. And even new fireplaces, either it still be wood, fancy, with blowers on them, or even propane or natural gas. They got some nice ones. But back in the early days, this is what they used to cook and warm their homes with, their cabins, the frontier, the pioneers, the settlers, back in the early days in these mountains. Fireplaces. Beautiful old fireplaces. And most of the heat went up the chimney. But that's the way it was. With an old good warm fire built in it, you huddle up next to it. And this is the way it was for centuries, an old fireplace with a good fire built in it. But things change just like it always does. Now the first wood and cook stove was invented by Benjamin Franklin back in the 1750s. Back in that range, give or take a year. Some of the early stoves like this invented. He was always tinkering and inventing stuff, but this was a big improvement for heating and cooking with. And here's some of the early old stoves you could buy way back in the day. Sorry you can't read the prices on these old clippings, but this is the kind of old stoves they really started out with. Some of them were real fancy. But the old fireplace couldn't be beat in these old homes. Out in these rural areas and these mountains, they kept you warm. And all kinds of little, they even slept next to them. Of course they had to. This is the only way they heated their home. But they went to these stoves for cooking. They're just some of the early old stoves. They're just collector's items now in most places. You hardly can find them. And people went to them. All different types. But this is basically what they started out with, the old wood cook stove. Old stoves like this. And here's some of the advertising for them, what they went for, their prices back in the day, back in the early 1900s, 20s, 30s. But this was a common stove back in its day. You can't even find these stoves now. They are collector's items. And they work like this. You build your heat in the bottom of it there, and the air would circulate around the burners on top and around the oven, and the smoke would go up the chimney, and you could adjust your fire burning by the damper on it, how much air it draws. And they even made old stoves like this in the early days. If you had indoor water, heat your water. This is an old layout. Most people didn't have indoor water, so this was not usable. But they come in all kinds of little stoves. The big cook stoves, the little ones like this, starting out. They heated their homes with them, and they cooked on them too. This is a place at Cage Cove I filmed. This is the Betty Gable house at the Gable Mill at Cage Cove. This is an old stove in here that the park keeps up. This is an old stove. Wonder how many meals has been cooked on that old thing. Beautiful old collector's item right there. But you can see this at Cage Cove. These old stoves like this became the commonplace in the old kitchens of the rural across America, and especially these mountains, for a long time before electricity came into these mountains. And many a young country girl learned to cook on these old stoves. Learned to cook. Gravy and biscuits, fried food of any kind, especially an old pan of fried taters. And learned to cook and bake, make pies, cornbread. This is how they learned. And I sure can remember grandmother slaving over these old stoves. They loved it. This was their way of life. And it seemed like nothing tastes better than something cooked on an old coal or wood-burning stove. There's a big old pot of soup beans on the stove all the time, pan of hot fried taters, some old crackling cornbread with some cow butter. Man, seems like anything you cooked on these old stoves tastes so good, and you could smell them too. And being an old country boy, wasn't nothing better than old fried squirrel or fried rabbit and some gravy and biscuits. And the old fireplace, it continued to be here in these old mountains and these old homes. This is how they heated for a long time. Long time. And the fireplace become more or less just a place for the family to get together, talk, tell stories, and just gather and be together. The good old times. But they heated their homes with stuff like this, the old warm morning stove. You'd have a cook stove in the kitchen, and other parts of the house that was cold, you'd have an old warm morning stove. They mostly just used coal. Old coal stoves. Old stoves like this. The earlier versions. And they'd get hot too with that coal. Now you can't find these stoves hardly anywhere. Maybe an old antique shop or a junk store, but they're rare to find. But these still worked awful well. But they used coal, most of them. Now these old people can tell you, using these old coal stoves and wood stoves, it was a chore. Getting up kindling wood to use in them to keep them stoves going. And I can remember many a times my grandmother, when I was a little old bitty thing, out there chopping kindling. It was a common place for these country women to do. Get them a load of kindling up, they'd chop it themselves. And there wasn't nothing growing up these hollers and these mountains. Everybody around their house somewhere had a load of coal or a pile of wood. This was commonplace for you stoves. Now here's an old picture, it's hard to believe. This is a picture out of East Tennessee. A family standing in front of a big old pile of kindling. They must have just got this ordered or cut it themselves. But look what a pile of kindling that is. These old stoves use it fast if you feed them, buddy. And this is just how they used to measure wood, and they still do today. A cord, half cord, quarter of a cord. But sometimes these measurements is not right. So I've cut a lot of wood, I tell you. I wished I had a pile of wood like this every winter coming in. That wood, you think that's a lot of wood? You feed that stove like a freight train in the cold weather. It don't last long. But most of it back in them days didn't have log splitters and chainsaws. It was cut by hand and it was split by hand. Now that's a lot of work. And they didn't do this in just a few months. They worked on this all year long to keep these old stoves going. That's the way it's always been in these mountains and these rural areas. A lot of people don't want nobody to burn wood anymore, but that's the way it is. But nowadays, for a furnace to heat your home, you don't have a fireplace or a stove. It's electric furnace or a gas furnace. And the old country wood-burning, coal-burning stoves, they're a thing of the past. I can't even lay my hands on one for this video. I tried. But anything, nowadays, electric stove of any kind you want, electric burners, convection stoves, gas, propane. But these old stoves like this is what built this country. This is what raised our people. So I hope you enjoy these little videos of our past and how our people used to live in these mountains. So I want to thank you for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next time.